In a new Gallup poll, 69% of Americans say transgender athletes should only be able to play on the teams that match their birth gender. This is reportedly a 7-point shift toward that position since 2021, which was at 62% then. This shift was also seen among Democrats, with 41% holding that viewpoint in 2021, 48% holding it now.
Also in the poll, 55% of Americans say that changing one's gender is morally wrong, while 43% consider it morally acceptable. When Gallup asked this question in 2021, 51% saw changing one's gender as morally wrong, and 46% said it was morally acceptable. Editor-in-chief of Gallup, Mohamed Younis, joins us now to discuss these findings. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. So tell us more about what you think were the big findings of this poll. Obviously, this is an issue we talk a lot on the show about. Seems to really animate the conservative movement right now. Honestly, conservative media very much covering gender issues, gender controversies, athletes. What are the takeaways? The
takeaways with this poll are certainly the two you mentioned, but also to keep in mind that this is a poll that also included questions about political and social identity. And we saw a relative high in Americans describing themselves as socially conservative. It's also notable that on both measures, both the moral acceptability and participation in sports, Americans are actually less accepting, if you will, than they were the last time we asked the question. So 55% of Americans currently say it's morally wrong to change one's gender, but only 39% of Americans say they personally know somebody who's told them, a coworker, a friend, a colleague, a family member, that's told them that they're transgender. So there's still the vast majority, if you will, of Americans still haven't made that personal connection. I think the other thing that's really important here is we see a difference in people's perceptions in terms of the acceptance morally, whether or not they know somebody who is transgender, having a more accepting impact. And that's obviously, we know that from just decades of social research.
And all of the gay marriage statistics.
And it's true with attitudes about immigrants. It's true here in the United States and really globally. It's a very common theory in sociological research that if you know somebody from an other group, you're more likely to have more positive views or a deeper understanding of that group than people who say they haven't. So we still have a lot of Americans that say they haven't met somebody.
Right.
But an important distinction is, despite knowing someone who's transgender or not personally, people are less favorable to this participation in sports aspect. And it is interesting that even Democrats, who are 7 in 10 say it's morally acceptable, 8 in 10 say it's morally acceptable, 7 in 10 say it's okay to participate in the sports, they're actually far less likely to do so when it comes to sports.
Before we get to sports, I just want to ask you about the framing of the first question, the morally acceptable. Was there any question about whether or not Americans should be permitted to do it regardless of what other Americans think of it? Because the real issue here politically, right, is that there are laws being passed to prevent people from doing what they want to do with their own bodies in their own consultation with their medical providers. I wonder if there is any questioning that gets at that more libertarian conceit of whether or not people should be allowed to. I can sit here and say I might not think it's morally acceptable for families to make their kids be vegan or to beat their kids or any number of things, to circumcise their kids. But if you ask me, do I think that people should be allowed to do those, it would be a very different answer, right? Yeah,
and we didn't ask that question in this poll, and that is a really important distinction, that the moral acceptability of a group doesn't necessarily directly mean that people are promoting discrimination against that group. Another really strong example of that is the favorability of China. So right now in America, China is viewed as the #1 enemy of the United States. And you could say, wow, well, that is really concerning because that means there's a lot of anti-Asian hate out there. And that's true, but they also have a very favorable view of countries like Japan and South Korea. So it really depends on the question you're specifically asking. We didn't ask about those legal rights, but when it comes to morality versus fairness and participation in sports, there is definitely a divide, even amongst people who are left of center, on whether or not that should be taking place.
I have seen, I think, more criticism from conservatives of it's Pride Month of kind of just the LGBT category this year than I can recall in previous years. I think there had been a sense that the right, except for very ardent religious conservatives, had largely given up on relitigating gay marriage, things of that nature, except when it's still going to fight the cake baking case where it really clashes with freedom of religion and freedom of expression, maybe. But those issues were settled and won, and most Americans, even a lot of Americans on the right, agreed with that. Based on reading your poll results, my perception would be that the trans category and the sort of the disinterested, including them in sports that even many Democrats have, is that like dragging down the entire LGBT category, back toward levels of non-acceptance that were, have last witnessed back in the aughts?
We don't see that in the numbers. So whether or not people are accepting of gay marriage, for example, is something we've been asking about for decades. Right now, 7 in 10 Americans support view being homosexual as morally acceptable, and even larger percentages support gay marriage. And we've seen huge shifts over just the past 30 years on those. So, as, again, going back to who you know and how it impacts your views, as more Americans inform themselves on what does it mean to be transgender? What does it mean to receive gender-affirming care? We know from other research we've done with transgender respondents that a relative minority, about 13% of those who identify as transgender in the United States, have received some kind of gender-affirming care. So is the conversation about transgender identity being hijacked, if you will, by one aspect or experience of being transgender in America, and how that's impacting the political conversation is notable. Again, of course, this is happening in a time when major abortion established law has been overturned with Dobbs. And in this same survey, we also asked about attitudes about abortion. So the left, had this moment where voters really highlighted that abortion was suddenly a more important issue after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Now the right basically has this issue, this idea that most Americans don't really understand or try to get their minds around what it means to be transgender and how to participate in things like sports. I think we're going to see both of those issues brought to the fore in this coming election.
Yeah, I do think the point about kind of the scale of this and whether or not it's being hijacked or exaggerated in some ways for political reasons is an important one. There was that famous moment where Matt Walsh was asked in an interview, I think by Joe Rogan, how many transgender youth he thought existed in the country, and he predicted like hundreds of thousands or something like that, maybe even millions, and the real answer was something like 4,000, which brings me to the next question about the getting into the sports issue. I wonder, again, when you're designing these questions, if there is a disaggregation between what people feel about, how people feel about trans people participating in the sport of their gender identity, if they are in the first and second grade, playing pee-wee softball or whatever, versus a competitive athletes where there's money and prestige and scholarships and the like on the line.
Absolutely.
And also more biological dimorphism when you're older and after puberty.
Yes, and I think those are just the beginning of all of the nuanced, really challenges that we face as researchers in getting our minds around what does a respondent think of when we ask about these questions. We're doing a lot of research in many different sort of directions, and first trying to understand what is the true incidence rate, or if you will, the presence of transgender Americans in America. Our latest assessment is that it's only about 0.6% of the population. In America today, overall, 7% of Americans identify as LGBT, but those rates, especially those who identify as bisexual, are far higher in younger generations of Americans. And that's another really important factor that will fundamentally change how Americans feel about this issue, is as younger Americans grow older in an environment where America is being more informed about what it means to have transgender identity, we're going to see likely these attitudes change along with that.
Yeah, I do think this is an interesting point, because so many of the laws that have been passed, there was an incident in a state out west, I think it was maybe Oklahoma, don't quote me on that, where there were local laws passed to prevent trans kids from playing with the gender of their choosing. And once they passed it, they realized that it was going to affect one elementary school aged girl in the state, and everybody just from a parental concern perspective realized, what are we doing here? This is silly. Let her play on the soccer team. It's not hurting anybody. And I also have some questions about in terms of what interventions could be on the table going forward if this is an issue of concern, at least on the competitive level. Is this a world where we say we have one completely open sports team that qualifying cis women, trans women, and cis men, trans men, everybody can participate in, and then have a separate league for cis women if the idea is the reason that we've had segregated sports by sex over time is because of the lack of advantage, competitive advantage from a physical perspective that cis women have and trans men then also have. Is it going to be a world where we have strict gender segregation based on sex assigned at birth, or is there going to be a arguably more inclusive division that accommodates the possibility of people who are not cis men being able to compete athletically in a larger group?
I think all of those questions are obviously ones the country's grappling with. Another complicating dynamic is America is a very local country. So a lot of these leagues, organizations, rules, associations, they're all very local organizations. And really a lot of the litigation, as you've seen, has been really taking those local decisions and challenging them at the state or at the national level. So really the answer is we don't know. And really a lot of it is still in flux. So the future will have to tell.
Mohamed Younis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
More Rising right after this.